Canadian social democratic thought up until the 1930s borrowed quite a few ideas from left-wingers in the United Kingdom and the United States. So, one of the lasting legacies of the LSR was to find a Canadian type of social democracy. The LSR put forth a quite Canadianized version of economic planning. It talked about the creation of a National Planning Commission by the federal government. This National Planning Commission would coordinate the efforts of the federal government and provincial governments to intervene in the Canadian economy. Ultimately, this would lead to quite a large number of new crown corporations owned by the federal government and some crown corporations also owned by provincial governments. Allowing both levels of government to pursue public ownership was seen as a way to achieve social democracy within Canada's federal system of government. Hi, and welcome to episode 9 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan and a member of the Perspectives Journal Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and the ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. In doing so, I explore the contribution of social democracy to Canadian history and provide you lessons for your own political activism today. In this episode, I want to examine the ideas of a group of professors who were not content just to teach in classrooms and read dusty old books in libraries. Rather, they jumped into politics in an attempt to help social democratic politicians around Canada get elected. I'm talking about the professors who came to be known as the CCF's Brain Trust, the League for Social Reconstruction. The year was 1930, and Canada had just entered the Great Depression. Unemployment was skyrocketing, and hunger was a daily fact of life for the working class in Canadian cities and on family farms in rural areas. In fact, the Canadian economic system was in such bad shape that it no longer was able to provide the basics for the average citizen, like employment, shelter, and food. The big businesses and the conservative and liberal politicians were the ones who had got Canada into this mess, but they did not seem to know what to do to get Canada out of it. As things got worse by the day, young academics at several Canadian universities began to question the ability of businessmen and their political allies to deal with the economic crisis. Even though they were academics with no political power, they asked themselves, can we do anything to end the Depression? Frank Underhill, an historian at the University of Toronto, decided to start a discussion group of intellectuals aimed at finding ways to get Canada out of the Great Depression. At the same time, a professor of law at McGill University named F.R. Scott was asking his colleagues if they would like to contribute to a book outlining possible ways to end the Depression. As luck would have it, both Underhill and Scott attended the annual Institute of Politics in Williamstown, Massachusetts in August of 1931. They had never met each other before, but they instantly hit it off. Both academics had been radicalized by the Depression. They shared the view that the capitalist economic system was failing badly, and Canada's two traditional parties were too beholden to big business to do anything about it. On a beautiful Sunday morning, Underhill and Scott decided to skip the conference proceedings and go for a hike up a nearby mountain. They talked about how they thought that a new political party would soon arise that would unite Canada's labor movement with Canada's radical farmer organizations. They both agreed that a group of intellectuals was needed to provide this new party with a coherent set of ideas and a well-thought-out platform. With every step up the mountain, radical change for Canada seemed more possible. At the peak of the mountain, they surveyed the valley below. It was at that moment that they decided to launch a Canadian-wide organization of intellectuals dedicated to spreading the social democratic ideas needed to get Canada out of the Great Depression. When they returned to Canada, they immediately started to recruit other professors to join their organization. In January of 1932, 5 professors from Montreal traveled to Toronto to iron out the details of the structure of the organization and to find a name. It was agreed that the new organization would be called the League for Social Reconstruction, or the LSR. The idea behind the name was that small tweaks to the social order would not do the job. Modest reforms were like patching a sinking ship with paper. Canada needed a complete reconstruction of its society to get out of the Great Depression. As such, it was decided that the main goal of the organization would be the generation of bold social democratic ideas that could end the economic depression gripping Canada. The professors at this meeting hoped that these bold ideas could influence public opinion and shape the actions of politicians. They decided the first order of business for the organization would be to establish study groups to understand the current social, political, and economic situation of Canada. These study groups could then use that knowledge to generate the ideas needed to get Canada out of the Depression. Then the LSR would produce as many pamphlets as possible and do as many lectures as possible to get their ideas circulating in the Canadian public and heard by Canadian politicians. Roughly 100 people showed up at the LSR's first meeting in Toronto in February 1932, and about 75 people were at the LSR's next meeting in Montreal a month later. All of those who attended these meetings became LSR members, and the organization that Underhill and Scott had envisioned at the peak of that mountain in Massachusetts 6 months earlier had become a reality. If there was a word to describe the people that attended those first LSR meetings, it would be impatient. The two meetings adopted a manifesto calling for the overhaul of the very structures of the Canadian economy, and they saw that such an overhaul was the only way to get Canada out of the Depression. The time to be timid had passed. The LSR felt that bold action was urgently needed to reduce the horrible poverty and misery that the Depression was bringing to the daily lives of Canadians. So the new organization did not waste any time. It hit the ground running like a sprinter in full stride. Local branches of the LSR were founded in any community where 10 or more people gathered together in the name of Social Reconstruction. Students formed their own branches of the LSR at several Canadian universities, and people who lived in places where branches could not be organized signed up as members at large. In only 1 year, the LSR grew to 17 branches and over 1,000 members. During that year, its members were hard at work in their study groups, seeking to understand what was really driving the Depression in Canada and how to end it. LSR members were also starting to produce a large number of pamphlets, and their ideas were being noticed by the media and politicians. At the beginning of 1933, the LSR faced its first big internal debate. Just as Underhill and Scott had predicted, the economic crisis had encouraged the farmer movement and the labor movement to join together to form a new social democratic political party. The LSR had sent observers to the convention in Calgary in 1932, where this new party had been founded and given the name of the Co-operative Commonwealth Federation, or the CCF. But what was to be the relationship between the CCF and the LSR? There ended up being different points of view on these questions, and the founders of the LSR were on opposite sides. Led by Underhill, many LSR members noted the similarities between the ideas of the CCF and the LSR. They saw an unequaled opportunity to help lay the intellectual foundation of a political party that could actually enact the policies needed to bring Canada out of the Depression. So they argued that the LSR should publicly announce its full support for the CCF and should become officially affiliated with the new party. Led by Scott, other LSR members wanted a more distant relationship between the LSR and the CCF. They felt that if the LSR formally joined the CCF, its important research and public education activities would stop due to its involvement in running political campaigns. Also, some people who would be happy to join an organization that promoted political education would be wary of joining a political party. So the LSR ran the risk of losing the ideas and energy of these types of people. At the end of the debate, it was decided that the LSR would publicly endorse the CCF and enter into an informal alliance with the new party. From now on, the fate of the LSR and the CCF would be firmly intertwined, like two strands of the same rope. The new partnership between the LSR and the CCF was cemented when the leadership of the CCF asked the leaders of the LSR to draft the party's first manifesto. The manifesto was to be debated at the CCF's first policy convention to be held in Regina at the end of the summer of 1933. The LSR leaders gladly agreed to draft the manifesto. They felt that the LSR was taking a huge leap forward. Up until now, the LSR had been generating ideas to educate the Canadian public about ways to end the Depression. Now, the LSR was writing the manifesto of the party that it thought could form the next government of Canada. Perhaps a bit naively, the LSR envisioned that its ideas were actually going to be put into place after the CCF won the next federal election. And it was convinced that its ideas could finally bring an end to the economic crisis that was devastating the lives of average Canadians. We can't forget that the leaders of the LSR were first and foremost academics. So they came up with an idea that probably only sounds good to academics. They decided that before writing the manifesto for the CCF, they would write a lengthy academic book. The book would be a collection of chapters written by university professors about the various problems facing Canada, and each chapter would suggest solutions to the problems that it described. Then, the first manifesto of the CCF could be written using ideas from this book. But it was January 1933, and the manifesto needed to be presented to the CCF convention by the end of July 1933. I've been involved in the publication of a lot of academic books during my career, and I can tell you that it is a slow and painful process. Writing up your research always gets put aside to attend to more pressing matters like grading and planning the courses to be offered in the next term. By late June of 1933, the LSR's book was only half written, and no progress had been made on the manifesto. Yet the manifesto was due to be handed into the CCF in a couple of weeks. The LSR leaders had done what they had told their students never to do. They had waited till the last minute to get started on their assignment. Fortunately, Underhill had some vacation booked with his family at a cottage about 150 kilometers north of Toronto. While we don't know how his family felt about him working during his holidays, we do know that he spent part of his vacation sketching out a draft of the manifesto. Underhill then returned to Toronto shortly after Canada Day and invited the other leaders of the LSR over to his house to discuss the drafts of the manifesto. They met on his porch on a hot and humid July evening. Underhill's fridge had broken down while he was away, so they had to drink lukewarm beer. Nonetheless, they proceeded with their meeting. After making some small changes, they approved the draft. Underhill then retyped the document and sent it off to J.S. Wordsworth, the CCF's leader. Wordsworth was delighted with the draft manifesto. He wrote back the following to Underhill: "I can only hope that the convention will adopt this carefully thought-out statement rather than attempting to throw in a lot of half-baked suggestions." Wordsworth then invited several of the LSR professors to be delegates to the convention that would be considering their draft manifesto. The CCF's first policy convention started on July 19, 1933 in a large room at City Hall in Regina. Stock prices and grain prices had been trending upwards during the previous couple of months, raising the hope that the Depression was ending. But they came crashing down the morning that the convention began. It was definitive proof to the delegates that Canada's economy was broken beyond any repair, and something drastic had to be done. By all accounts, the LSR professors were a hit at the Regina Convention. The farmers, preachers, and workers who were delegates had only heard of the LSR through pamphlets that they had read. They were now able to meet the people behind the LSR, and they were impressed with their knowledge and enthusiasm. The discussion of the LSR's draft manifesto lasted 2 whole days. Many parts of the manifesto were adopted with no changes. Most of the attention of the delegates focused on rewriting the clauses on taxation, agriculture, and the emergency program that appeared at the end of the document. Like any NDP meeting today, there was a disagreement between the moderates and the radicals. Some of the farmer leaders, particularly those from Ontario, felt that the manifesto sounded too socialist. Other delegates, especially those from British Columbia, said that it was not socialist enough, and they wanted to push the ideas of the new party much farther to the left. Perhaps as a way to appease these radicals, one particularly radical statement made into the final version of the manifesto. The last line of the manifesto went on to become the most famous sentence in Canadian social democratic history. The line goes as follows: "No CCF government will rest content until it has eradicated capitalism and put into operation the full program of socialized planning which will lead to the establishment in Canada of the Co-operative Commonwealth." The part about the intent of the CCF being to eradicate capitalism was controversial at the time and remains controversial to this day. It should be noted that this line was not actually in the first draft of the manifesto that was originally sent by the LSR to the CCF convention. The line was added to the document sometime during the party's deliberations in Regina. In fact, you could probably say it was an example of the kind of half-baked suggestion that Wordsworth feared would make it into the final version. Though it should be said that who actually added this line is not a matter of historical record and remains a mystery to this day. Leaving the last line aside, the manifesto was adopted in a form that was pretty close to what Underhill had drafted at his summer cottage about a month earlier. The manifesto is now known as the Regina Manifesto, and it served as the manifesto of the CCF for the next 2 decades. It was a gratifying moment for the LSR leaders when the delegates in Regina voted to adopt the document that they had drafted. The LSR had set out a couple of years ago to do something to help Canada get out of the Great Depression. Now, a new political party of workers, farmers, and socialists had adopted the manifesto that the LSR had largely wrote. The media was also starting to take notice of the LSR. The press referred to the LSR as the CCF's brain trust. One journalist even wrote that the CCF has behind it trained thinkers who have power to express coherent logical views well based on socialist philosophy and practice. After the Regina Convention, the LSR threw itself into the organization of the CCF for the next federal election that was expected sometime in 1934 or 1935. Its members spoke at CCF meetings, created new CCF clubs, and produced a very large quantity of pamphlets about social democratic ideas. The leaders of the LSR joined the national executive of the CCF and became important fundraisers for the party. The LSR even created a radio series on CBC entitled The Depression and the Way Out. Then, in September of 1935, the long-awaited book that had been intended to inspire the CCF's first manifesto was finally published. It was entitled Social Planning for Canada. It contained 528 pages of detailed analysis of the Canadian economy and plenty of social democratic ideas designed to end the Depression. By that time, the country had been plunged into a federal election, and voters appeared angry about the economic crisis and the federal government's inability to solve it. Several LSR members who gathered to celebrate the publication of the book wondered what effect, if any, the book would have on the upcoming election. Would the CCF actually form the next government and put the LSR's ideas into government policy, they asked? Could a group of academics really change Canadian politics, they wondered. The 1934 election proved to be a massive disappointment for the LSR. Voters rejected the conservative Bennett government, and the Conservative lost almost 100 seats. However, the main beneficiaries of the Conservatives' electoral difficulties were the Liberals, a party that the LSR and the CCF warned would never take the bold actions needed to end the Depression. The CCF won only 7 out of the 245 seats in the House of Commons, and the 2 LSR professors who were CCF candidates both went down in defeat. The leaders of the LSR did not know it yet. The organization was about to go into a slow and gradual decline following the 1935 election. Some members of the LSR started to drift back into the daily routines of academia. Others left the LSR to devote their time to unions and other types of social movements. A core group of LSR activists did stay on. This group published another academic book in 1938 entitled Democracy Needs Socialism. They also acquired a magazine called the Canadian Forum to spread social democratic ideas. But the activities of the LSR became more and more integrated into the activities of the CCF over time. The biographer of the LSR writes that after May 1936, there were no joint CCF-LSR meetings. The reason was that such meetings were proving unnecessary since the operations of the two organizations had become so closely integrated. The LSR had become the unofficial drafter of most CCF policy statements. It was also playing a crucial role in organizing fundraising and election campaigns for the CCF. By the 1940 federal election, the LSR had almost been completely absorbed into the CCF, and most of the LSR branches were inactive. The 1940 election was another disappointment for the LSR. The CCF only increased from 7 to 8 seats in the House of Commons, and its popular vote actually declined. In 1942, only a decade after it was created, the LSR ceased to exist. How should the contribution of the LSR to Canadian history be evaluated? I think we can point to 3 notable legacies. First, left-wing academics were not really involved much in politics prior to the 1930s. The activity of the LSR established the CCF and subsequently the NDP as the political home for left-wing Canadian academics. In fact, you can't even go to an NDP event these days without finding at least one professor in the crowd. Second, the LSR was the intellectual force behind the Regina Manifesto, which remains to this day the most famous social democratic text in Canadian history. Even though the LSR did not add the manifesto's most famous line, its fingerprints all over the document. From the beginning of the 1930s until the 1950s, social democrats in Canada always pointed to the manifesto as a statement of what they truly stood for. Even after the CCF officially replaced the Regina Manifesto with the Winnipeg Declaration in 1956, it remained the document by which all other texts of Canadian social democracy were judged. Perhaps because it was the first document to outline what the CCF-NDP stood for, its contents are still discussed and debated at party gatherings today. One of the things I did when I first became involved in NDP was to read the Regina Manifesto. Like lots of other social democrats in Canada, it still shapes my thinking today, even though I probably don't agree with every line in it. Finally, Canadian social democratic thought up until the 1930s borrowed quite a few ideas from left-wingers in the United Kingdom and the United States. So one of the lasting legacies of the LSR was to find a Canadian type of social democracy. To see what I mean, I'll just take 2 examples from the LSR's Social Planning for Canada. First, the LSR addresses the dominance of the Liberals and Conservatives in Canadian politics. It says there is no difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives. They are like the Tweedledee and Tweedledum of Canadian politics. According to the LSR, the real problem for average Canadians is that both Conservative and Liberal politicians are ideologically opposed to constraining the free market. Their reluctance to talk about the government intervening in the economy is because that might reduce the profits of the big businessmen who finance their election campaigns. The solution for the LSR is a social democratic party that is financed by its members and dedicated to reducing the poverty of the Canadian working class. Second, the LSR put forth a quite Canadianized version of economic planning. It talked about the creation of a National Planning Commission by the federal government. This National Planning Commission would coordinate the efforts of the federal government and provincial governments to intervene in the Canadian economy. Ultimately, this would lead to quite a large number of new crown corporations owned by the federal government and some crown corporations also owned by provincial governments. Allowing both levels of government to pursue public ownership was seen as a way to achieve social democracy within Canada's federal system of government. To my mind, the activity of the LSR provides a valuable lesson for today. It's not enough for academics to just study social change. They should try to make social change too. Indeed, the LSR's story shows how intellectuals have a role to play in advancing social democracy. They can lay the intellectual groundwork for the policies that will ultimately make a social democratic party successful. This is why organizations like the Broadbent Institute are so important. The Broadbent Institute brings academics like myself out of the ivory tower and into dialogue with social democratic politicians and activists. It is these types of dialogues, similar to the one between the LSR and the CCF delegates at the 1932 Regina Convention, that bring about social change. I'm Dave McGrane, and thanks for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms, and share it with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in any of the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more about social democracy in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And for more information on the work of the Broadbent Institute, subscribe to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. Next time, we'll look at one of the most dynamic father-son duos in Canadian political history. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.